The young architect stood in my office doorway clutching a leather portfolio against his chest like a shield. 22 years old, maybe 23, fresh from university with that particular combination of confidence and terror that comes from knowing just enough to recognize how much you don't know. Mr. Fletcher, he cleared his throat. I'm David Hayes from the School of Architecture. Professor Morrison said you might have time to speak with me about early Montana homestead design. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. 68 years old and still working 3 days a week because retirement, I discovered, was just another word for slowly dying of boredom. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old blueprints, the scent of a life spent translating problems into solutions. David settled into the chair and opened his portfolio with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. He extracted a sheet of drafting paper, smoothed it flat, and turned it toward me. The sketch showed a simple cabin, 16 by 20 feet, surrounded by an extended roof line that created a covered corridor on all four sides. The proportions were exact, Oceanote. The angle of the roof, 35 degrees. The spacing of support posts, 8 feet on center. Whoever had drawn this understood the original design perfectly. This structure, David said, his finger tracing the extended roof. We found 3 examples of it in the Prickly Pear Valley, all built between 1873 and 1880. The engineering is remarkable for that period. Covered wood storage, integrated weather protection, accessibility during severe conditions. He looked up, eyes bright with academic curiosity. Do you know who invented this design? I leaned back in my chair, the old leather creaking beneath my weight. Through the window behind David, March snow fell across Missoula in fat, lazy flakes. Nothing like the killing snows of 57 years ago. Nothing like the winter that taught me what survival really meant. I knew her, I said, the woman who designed it. David's eyes widened, her but Mrs. Margaret Brennan, though everyone called her Maggie. I reached for my pipe, the familiar ritual buying time to decide where to begin. She taught me to read when I was 11 years old, but more importantly, she taught me that intelligence has nothing to do with gender. And that courage isn't about strength. It's about doing what's right when everyone tells you you're wrong. I tamped tobacco into the bowl, struck a match, drew until the ember glowed. I was 11 years old in the spring of 1873, I began, and I couldn't read a single word. The young architect settled back in his chair, portfolio forgotten. And I let myself fall backward through time to a boy who didn't yet understand that the desperate widow who just arrived in the valley would change not just his life, but the way entire communities survived the brutal Montana winters. Prickly Pear Valley, Montana Territory. April 1873. The Sunday morning services in Unionville lasted exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes. I know because I'd counted every minute of every service since my mother died 2 years before. Reverend Samuel Whitmore had a voice like distant thunder and a talent for making Bible stories feel both urgent and incomprehensible to a boy who couldn't read the words he was quoting. My father, Owen Fletcher, sat beside me on the hard wooden pew, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his face showing nothing. He'd mastered that expression after Anna Fletcher was taken by the cholera in the summer of 1871. For her death, there had been laughter in our cabin, music even. My mother had owned a fiddle she'd carried all the way from Pennsylvania, and sometimes on winter evenings she'd play, while my father sang in his deep, surprisingly gentle voice. After she died, the fiddle sat silent in its case. My father stopped singing, and I stopped believing that words on a page mattered because my mother had been teaching me to read, and now she was gone, and the alphabet had died with her. Reverend Whitmore's voice rose to its customary crescendo, signaling the approach of the final hymn. I shifted on the pew, already anticipating the moment when I could escape into the spring sunshine and away from all these words I didn't understand. Then the church door opened. Heads turned. Reverend Whitmore's cadence faltered. In a congregation of 43 regular attendees in a town of maybe 60 souls, a newcomer was an event. The woman who stepped through the doorway moved with the careful dignity of someone who knew she was being watched and refused to show discomfort. She wore a dress of dark blue wool, threadbare at the cuffs, but clean and carefully pressed. Behind her came 3 children, descending in height like steps on a staircase. A girl, maybe 9 years old, with brown hair, pulled back severe and tight. She held a book, I noticed, an actual book clutched against her chest. A boy, 7 or so, with that restless energy that came from trying to hold still when every muscle wanted to run, and a small child no more than 4 who clung to his mother's skirts with both hands and stared at the congregation with wishing-eyed, uncertain eyes. The woman's gaze swept the church, once cataloging every face before she guided her children to an empty pew near the back. They settled with minimal fuss, the older girl opening her book, immediately the younger boy swinging his legs, the smallest child pressed tight against his mother's side. Reverend Whitmore recovered his rhythm and pushed through to the closing hymn, but I barely heard it. I was watching the girl with the book, 9 years old, and she was reading. Actually reading, not just pretending or looking at pictures. Her lips moved slightly as she followed the words, and once she reached over to point out something to her younger brother, who leaned in to look. When the service ended, the usual pattern held. The men clustered near the door discussing weather and prices and which families needed help with spring planting. The women gathered in the churchyard, exchanging news and evaluating newcomers with the ruthless efficiency of people who understood that survival often depended on knowing who could be trusted. My father joined the men. I stood awkwardly between groups, too old to run with the younger children, too young to be included in adult conversations, and too illiterate to lose myself in a book like the girl from the back pew. Reverend Whitmore approached the newcomer family with his customary welcoming smile, the one that managed to be both genuinely warm and slightly patronizing. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying across the churchyard. "I'm Reverend Samuel Whitmore. These good people and I are pleased to have new faces among us." He paused, waiting. The woman stood straight, meeting his eyes. "Margaret Brennan, Reverend. These are my children, Catherine, Daniel, and James." The girl looked up from her book long enough to nod politely. The middle boy offered a gap-toothed grin. The smallest child hid behind his mother's skirts. "Brennan," Whitmore repeated, his brow furrowing slightly. "Would that be the claim west of the Garrett place, the one Harold Pitts abandoned last winter?" "My late husband filed that claim 2 years ago," Margaret said. The word late came out steady, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Fresh grief then, recent loss. "He worked the mines in Butte. There was an accident. The claim was paid for, and the children miss, and I need a home." A ripple moved through the women's group. Whispers carefully modulated, but still audible. "Widow, 3 children. That cabin." Eleanor Blackwell stepped forward. She ran Unionville's only trading post and had buried 2 husbands of her own. 52 years old, with eyes like a hawk and a mind that calculated profit margins faster than most people could count change. "Mrs. Brennan," Eleanor said, and there was something in her tone that made it less greeting and more assessment. "That's ambitious. A woman alone with 3 children. That cabin needs considerable work, and winter comes early here. Much earlier than wherever you came from." "Ohio," Margaret said. "Cincinnati. My father ran a sawmill there." "A sawmill?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose fractionally. "How interesting. And does a sawmill owner's daughter know anything about surviving a Montana winter?" The 2 women regarded each other across 3 feet of churchyard dirt. Around them, conversations had stopped. Everyone was listening now, waiting to see how the newcomer would handle Eleanor Blackwell's particular brand of welcoming skepticism. "I know timber," Margaret said quietly. "I know calculation and measurement. I know that problems have solutions if you're willing to think instead of just accepting what's always been done." She shifted her youngest child to her other hip. "What I don't know yet, I'll learn. That's what people do when their children's lives depend on it." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a fellow survivor. "The trading post is on Main Street," Eleanor said. "Such as Main Street is. When you need supplies, we'll discuss terms." She turned away, conversation over judgment deferred. The cluster of women began to disperse, their whispers starting up again as soon as they had distance. I caught fragments as they passed. "Won't make it through winter. 3 children and no man. That cabin is practically falling down." My father had been watching the exchange from his position near the church door. Now he crossed the churchyard, his boots crunching on the still frozen ground, and stopped in front of Margaret Brennan. "Owen Fletcher," he said, "my son and I have the claim 3/4 of a mile east of yours. If you need help with heavy work, send word." Margaret studied him with the same careful assessment she'd used on everyone else. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. That's kind." "Not kind," my father said. "Practical. We're all neighbors out here. Helping each other is how we survive." He paused, then added, "My Anna, she died 2 years back. I understand something about managing alone." For the first time since entering the church, Margaret's composed expression cracked slightly. Just a flicker of shared grief, one widow recognizing another's loss. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. My father nodded and uncomfortable with sympathy as he always was. He turned to leave, then seemed to remember I existed. "Peter, come on." I started to follow, but the girl Catherine had looked up from her book again. She was staring at me with frank curiosity. "Can you read?" she asked. The question hit like a fist to the stomach. Heat flooded my face. Around us, several adults had paused, waiting for my answer. The lie stuck in my throat. "No." Catherine tilted her head, considering this information without judgment. "I can teach you if you want. Mama taught me, and now I teach Daniel. It's not hard once you understand the patterns." "Catherine," Margaret said quietly, a gentle warning, but the damage was done. Every adult within earshot had heard. Peter Fletcher, 11 years old, couldn't read. The widow's 9-year-old daughter had to offer to teach him. I turned and walked away, my father's hand landing heavy on my shoulder as I passed him. We didn't speak on the ride home. We rarely did anymore. But that night, lying in my bed in the small cabin I shared with my father, I thought about the girl with the book, about patterns and teaching and the casual assumption that learning was possible. I thought about my mother who died before finishing what she'd started. And I thought about Margaret Brennan standing straight and steady in that churchyard facing down Eleanor Blackwell's skepticism with nothing but quiet certainty. Something had begun that morning. I didn't understand it yet. But like the first crack in a river ice before spring thaw, I could feel the shift starting. 3 days later, just after sunset, Margaret Brennan walked into our yard. My father and I were finishing evening chores, the last of the daylight fading behind the western hills. She appeared like a figure from a painting, silhouetted against the dimming sky, her worn shawl pulled tight against the spring chill. "Mr. Fletcher," she called. "Might I have a word?" My father straightened from the water trough he'd been checking, surprise evident on his face. "Mrs. Brennan, is something wrong?" "No," she said, moving closer. "Nothing wrong, but I have a proposition." The word hung in the air. My father's expression went carefully neutral. "I need help." Margaret continued, her voice steady and businesslike. "I need someone who can handle heavy work. Cutting timber, setting posts, lifting beams. I can do some of it myself, but not all. Not fast enough to finish what needs finishing before winter." "What needs finishing?" my father asked. "A structure," Margaret said, "a building project I've planned. I need strong hands to help construct it. In return," she paused, glanced at me where I stood, half hidden behind my father. "In return, if you'll allow Peter to come to my cabin 3 evenings a week, my daughter Catherine will teach him to read. She's quite good at it, patient, and she enjoys teaching." The silence that followed felt enormous. I stared at my father's back, trying to read the tension in his shoulders. "You want me to help you build something," my father said slowly, "in exchange for my son learning to read from a 9-year-old girl?" "Yes, that's—" He stopped, started again. "Mrs. Brennan, no offense to your daughter, but I'm not sure that's a fair trade." "Isn't it?" Margaret met his eyes. "You need Peter to learn. That's not a luxury here, it's necessary. But you can't teach it him yourself, can you, Mr. Fletcher? And there's no school within 15 miles. Catherine can solve that problem. In return, I need muscle and height and the ability to lift things I can't manage alone. You can solve my problem." She paused. "That seems fair to me." My father's jaw worked. I knew what this was costing him. Montana Territory in 1873 was not kind to men who couldn't provide everything their families needed. Accepting help, especially from a woman, especially in exchange for education from a child, would invite talk, probably mockery. But I needed to read. He knew it. I knew it. And Margaret Brennan knew it too. 3 evenings a week, my father asked. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, after your supper, before full dark, 1 hour each time. And the building work, as much as you can spare. Mornings are best, 4 hours perhaps. I'll work alongside you. My father looked at me. really looked the way he hadn't since my mother died. I saw him seeing me, 11 years old, growing, needing things he couldn't give. All right, he said finally, we have an agreement. Margaret's shoulders, which I only now realized had been rigid with tension, relaxed slightly. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. We start tomorrow. Tomorrow, my father agreed. She nodded once and turned to leave. But she paused, looking back at me. Peter, bring something you want to learn to write. Your name maybe, or a word that matters to you. That's where we'll start. Then she was gone, walking back across the darkening valley toward the cabin everyone said she'd never survive in. My father watched her go. Well, he said quietly, that's something I didn't expect. Do I really have to learn from a girl? The question came out more petulant than I'd intended. My father's hand came down on my shoulder, not hard but firm enough to get my attention. Your mother taught me to read when I was 25 years old boy. I was a grown man and she was barely 20, and every time we sat down to practice I felt like a damn fool. But you know what I got out of it? I shook my head. The last letter she wrote before the cholera took her. I can read it, Peter. I can read her words whenever I miss her voice. Can you imagine how much that means? His grip tightened. You go to Mrs. Brennan's cabin and you learn from that little girl and you don't complain about it. You understand? Yes, sir. Good. He released my shoulder. Now get inside and think about what word you want to start with. I lay awake that night trying to decide. My name felt obvious. My mother's name felt too painful. Finally, I settled on a word I'd heard Reverend Whitmore use, a word I didn't fully understand, but that seemed important. Hope. I would learn to write hope. The first lesson happened 2 evenings later in the Brennan cabin with my father standing awkward and large in the doorway. The cabin was smaller than ours and in worse condition. Water stains darkened the ceiling in 4 distinct places. The chinking between logs had gaps you could see daylight through, but it was clean, everything in its place, and a fire burned steady in the hearth. Catherine sat at a rough wooden table, a precious piece of paper in front of her, a stick of charcoal in her hand. The younger boy Daniel sat beside her watching. The smallest one, James, played with wooden blocks near the fire. Margaret stood near the hearth, and I realized with the start that she was working on something. A large piece of bark lay flat on a crate covered with marks. Numbers, lines, diagrams. Mrs. Brennan, my father said, we're here. She looked up, and for just a moment I saw the exhaustion in her face. Then she smiled, and it vanished behind determination. Mr. Fletcher, Peter, thank you for coming. She gestured to Catherine. I'll leave you to it. My father nodded to me and stepped back outside. I heard him talking to Margaret in low tones, discussing where to start tomorrow's work. I sat across from Catherine at the table, feeling enormous and clumsy. She was tiny, this 9-year-old girl with serious eyes and careful hands. What word did you choose? She asked. Hope. She considered this, then nodded. That's a good word. 4 letters. Not too hard, not too easy. She drew the letters on the paper with confident strokes. H-O-P-E. Do you see the shapes? I stared at the marks. They meant nothing to me. Look, Catherine said, patient as a saint. H is like a fence, 2 posts and a rail. O is like an egg all round. P is like, she paused, thinking, like a post with a comb, and E is 3 fingers, C pointing left. Slowly, incredibly, the marks began to transform. Not into meaning yet, but into things I could visualize. A fence, an egg, a post, fingers. Now you try, Catherine said, pushing the charcoal toward me. My first attempt looked like something a drunk spider might track across snow. Catherine didn't laugh. It takes practice, she said simply. Try again. Think about the shapes, not the letters. You're building, not writing. Building. That I understood. I tried again, and again, and again. By the end of the hour, I had produced 17 attempts at the word hope. 16 of them were terrible. But the 17th, the very last one, actually looked like letters. There, Catherine said, satisfaction in her voice. That's good. Practice that at home. Tomorrow we'll learn how to sound it out. I looked at her across the table, this child who was teaching me what my dead mother hadn't lived to finish. Why are you helping me? I asked. She blinked, surprised by the question. Because you want to learn, And because Mama says that keeping knowledge to yourself when others need it is, she paused clearly reciting something she'd heard, is a waste of everyone's time. Outside, my father called that it was time to leave soon. I stood still, clutching my 17th attempt at hope. At the door, I paused and looked back at Margaret, still bent over her bark, covered in diagrams. "Mrs. Brennan, what are you working on?" She looked up, and something in her expression shifted. "A problem, Peter, a very large problem. I'm trying to figure out how to keep my family alive through winter when the numbers say I can't." The honesty of it shocked me. Adults didn't usually speak to children that way. Not about fear, not about problems that might not have solutions. "Can you solve it?" I asked. Margaret looked at the diagrams, at the numbers, at the careful calculations covering every inch of bark. When she looked back at me, her eyes were steady. "I have to," she said simply, "because the alternative is unacceptable." I thought about that all the way home. About problems and solutions and alternatives that couldn't be accepted. And I thought about the word I'd written 17 times, hope. Maybe Margaret Brennan had chosen it too. Not to help, to judge. He sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, 63 years old, and carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. 26 Montana winters had taught him that optimism was a luxury and skepticism was survival. Margaret stood beside her cabin, that piece of bark in her hands, studying it like a general reviewing battle plans. She'd changed from her church dress into work clothes, practical and patched. Her children sat on the cabin steps, watching with the quiet intensity of people who understood their lives depended on what happened next. "Mrs. Brennan," Walter called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You planning to start digging today?" "I am Mr. Brennan." "You know what you need then? For a proper winter," Margaret's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. "You told me at church, 8 cords minimum. That's stacked 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, 8 times. And I need to cut it, split it, and stack it before October, while also maintaining the cabin, feeding my children, and putting up enough food to last 7 months. Walter nodded slowly. "That's right. You got the numbers correct. Now tell me how much firewood you got cut so far." "Half a cord." "Half," Walter spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You need 16 times what you got, and summer's already using itself up. You see the problem." "I see the problem you think I have," Margaret said. "But you're solving the wrong equation." Walter's eyebrows rose. My father, standing beside me, went very still. "The wrong equation," Walter repeated. "You're asking how to cut 8 cords of firewood. I'm asking how to need less than 8 cords while getting more heat." Margaret moved closer, holding up her bark covered in calculations. "Pine at 40% moisture content produces roughly 10 million BTUs per cord. Pine at 20% moisture produces 14.3 million. That's a 43% increase in heat output from the same volume of wood." Walter stared at her. "You calculated British thermal units." "My father ran a sawmill. I grew up understanding moisture content, heat values, and structural engineering." She pointed to the cabin. "Traditional wood storage sits on the ground, gets rained on, gets buried in snow. By the time you burn it, you're burning water weight. You lose 30 to 40% of your potential heat to moisture. So you plan to keep your wood dry." Walter's tone suggested this was not the revelation she seemed to think it was. "Everyone tries that. Not dry, perfectly dry. Protected from precipitation, elevated off the ground for air circulation, and accessible regardless of weather conditions." Margaret gestured to the space around her cabin. "If I extend the roof outwards 6 feet on all 4 sides, creating a covered corridor, I can stack 4.5 cords in that protected space. 4.5 cords at 20% moisture equals roughly 6 cords at 40% moisture. Add 2 more cords for margin, and I need 6.5 total, not 8. The silence that followed felt like a physical thing. "You want to build a roof around your cabin," Walter said finally. "An extended roof. The cabin stays as it is, but the roof line extends outward, supported by posts set every 8 feet. 35-degree pitch to shed snow. The wood stays under cover, stays dry, stays accessible." "I never seen anyone do that." "No," Margaret agreed. "But you've also never seen anyone calculate heat efficiency by moisture content. Just because something hasn't been done doesn't mean it shouldn't be." Walter looked at the cabin, at Margaret, at the bark full of numbers. Something shifted in his weathered face. Not quite respect, not yet. But the first crack in his certainty. "You're gambling your children's lives on mathematics," he said. "I'm gambling their lives on physics," Margaret corrected. "Mathematics is just how I prove the physics will work." Walter gathered his reins. "I'll be interested to see how this turns out, Mrs. Brennan. Interested and hoping you're right, because if you're wrong, those children will freeze." He touched his hat brim. "Good day." He rode off and Margaret stood watching him go, the bark still clutched in her hands. "He thinks I'm crazy," she said quietly. "Maybe," my father replied. "But crazy people don't usually show their work with that much detail." "When do we start digging?" The first post hole took 3 hours. Montana ground in April is frozen solid 2 feet down, then turns to clay that fights every shovel thrust like it has personal grudges. My father swung the pickaxe, breaking up the hard earth. Margaret used a long iron bar to pry loose the chunks. I scooped out the debris with a hand shovel, my 11-year-old arms burning with effort. Catherine and Daniel hauled the dirt away in a wooden bucket, dumping it in a pile that would eventually be used to fill back around the posts. Young James stayed on the cabin steps playing with rocks and occasionally calling encouragement. "3 feet deep," Margaret said, checking the hole with a measured pole. "That puts the bottom below the frost line. If we don't go that deep, winter frost heave will push the post up and the whole structure will fail." "How will you know about frost lines?" my father asked, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. My father's sawmill was in Cincinnati, but he consulted on construction projects as far north as Cleveland. I watched him calculate foundation depths based on frost penetration. She measured again, nodded satisfaction. "This is good. 15 more to go. 15 more. 3 hours each. 45 hours of digging." I looked at my father. He looked at the cabin, at Margaret's determined face, at the children watching with hope they were trying to hide. "We'll need help," he said. "This is too much for 3 people to finish in time." "I can't afford to hire help." "I wasn't suggesting you hire anyone." My father planted his shovel. "I'll talk to some of the other men. Explain what you're doing. Maybe they'll understand." Margaret's expression suggested she doubted that very much, but she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher." We dug 3 more holes that first day. By evening, my hands were blistered raw, and my back felt like it had been bent permanently into a curve. But 4 holes stood ready, 4 posts waited nearby, and 4 16-foot distances marked where the extended roof would reach. On the walk home, my father said, "You understand what she's doing, don't you? Building a big roof. Building a solution to a problem everyone else thinks can't be solved." He glanced at me. "Pay attention to how she does it, Peter. That's engineering. Not just building what you're told to build, but imagining what could be built and then making it real." That night at my reading lesson, Catherine taught me the word build. 5 letters. B like a snowman with 2 bellies. U like a cup. I like a stick. L like a corner. D like a belly facing backward. While I practiced, I watched Margaret at her makeshift desk. She'd added new calculations to her bark, checking and rechecking her numbers. The lamplight cast shadows under her eyes, making her look older, more fragile. "How do you know it will work?" I asked suddenly. She looked up surprised. "The design, all of it. The math, the moisture. What if you calculated wrong?" Catherine had stopped teaching, listening. Daniel leaned against his mother's chair. James dozed by the fire. Margaret set down her charcoal. "Come here, Peter." I crossed to her desk. She picked up 2 pieces of firewood from the box beside the hearth. One from deep in the pile, one from the top near the door. "Hold these," she said. I took them. One felt heavy, solid. The other was noticeably lighter. "The heavy one is wet," Margaret explained. "Maybe 35–40% moisture. The lighter one has been drying under the eave for 3 weeks. Maybe 22% moisture. Put them in the stove." I did. We watched. The wet wood hissed and smoked, the flames struggling to take hold. The dry wood caught immediately, burning hot and clean, the heat radiating outward in waves I could feel from 5 feet away. "Same species of tree," Margaret said. "Same size pieces, cut the same week. The only difference is moisture content. And look at the difference in heat output." The demonstration was undeniable. The dry wood was producing at least twice the heat, maybe more. Now imagine, Margaret continued, that every piece of wood you burn all winter is that dry, never wet, never smoky, always producing maximum heat. You see why I need that roof? It's not just about convenience, it's about survival. I saw. For the first time, I truly saw what she was building. Not just a roof, a system, a solution to a problem that had killed people, that had forced families to abandon claims, that made every winter a desperate race against dwindling fuel supplies. "You're going to save people," I said. Margaret's expression softened. "I'm going to save my children first. If it helps others after, that's good, but they're my priority." It was the most honest thing any adult had ever said to me. 3 weeks into construction, I got into a fight. The Hensley brothers caught me after church behind the building where adults couldn't see. There were three of them, ages 12 to 14, and they'd been waiting for an opportunity. "Heard you're learning to read from a little girl," Jake Hensley said. "The oldest, the meanest. That true, Fletcher?" I didn't answer. My father had taught me that silence was often stronger than words. "It is true," Jake's brother Mark chimed in. "Whole town knows. Peter Fletcher, 11 years old, getting taught by a 9-year-old girl because he's too stupid to learn like a real boy." "I'm not stupid," I said quietly. "Then why can't you read?" Jake stepped closer. "My little sister can read and she's only 7. You some kind of idiot." The first punch came fast, catching me in the stomach. I doubled over, gasping. The second hit my shoulder as I turned. The third I blocked. Then I stopped thinking and started fighting. I was outnumbered but furious, and fury made me dangerous. I got Jake in the nose, felt the satisfying crunch of cartilage. Mark got my ear, but I got his eye. The third brother, Sam, tried to grab my arms from behind, but I threw my head back and connected with his mouth. It probably lasted less than a minute. It felt like hours. When adults finally heard the commotion and came running, we were all bloodied. Jake's nose streamed red. Mark's eye was swelling shut. Sam had lost a tooth. I had a split lip and a black eye forming, but I was still standing. My father grabbed me by the collar and hauled me away without a word. We rode home in silence. At the cabin, he finally spoke. "You gonna tell me what that was about?" I touched my swelling lip, winced. "They said I was stupid for learning from Catherine." My father was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You know what your mother told me when I was learning to read from her?" I shook my head. "She said there's no shame in learning from someone younger or smaller or different. The only shame is in refusing to learn at all." He studied my battered face. "Those boys, they'll go through life thinking they know everything they need to know. You'll go through life learning. Which one you think will end up smarter?" "The one who learns," I said. "Damn right." He fetched water and a cloth. "Clean yourself up. You've got a reading lesson in 2 hours. And if you show up at Mrs. Brennan's looking like you lost a fight with a mountain cat, she'll think I can't take care of you." I cleaned up. I went to my lesson. Catherine saw my face and didn't ask questions, just taught me the word courage, with the same patience she showed everything else. And that night, while I practiced writing courage over and over, I realized I'd learned something the Hensley brothers never would. Real strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about showing up to learn from a 9-year-old girl, even when people called you stupid for it. By mid-July, the post holes were finished and the real work began. 16 posts, each one 8 feet tall and 8 inches in diameter, cut from dead standing pine, we harvested from the forest a half-mile distant. Every tree had to be felled, stripped, cut to length, and dragged back to the cabin. My father handled the felling. Margaret cut them to exact length with a cross-cut saw measuring 3 times before each cut. I helped strip bark with a draw knife, the blade chattering over knots and pitch. The posts were heavy, 200 pounds each. Getting them upright in the holes required all 3 of us, plus a system of ropes and leverage that Margaret designed using principles I didn't fully understand, but which worked flawlessly. "It's a simple lever," she explained as we positioned the 3rd post. "The longer the lever arm, the less force required to lift the weight. We're not actually lifting 200 pounds. We're applying maybe 60 pounds of force over a mechanical advantage of 3 to 1. I understood about half of that, but I understood that the post went into the hole perfectly vertical, and when we packed stones and earth around the base, it stood solid and true. "How'd you learn this?" I asked her during a water break. "My father." She wiped sweat from her face, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. He believed daughters should understand his business as well as sons would have. I spent my childhood in that sawmill, watching him solve problems, calculate loads, design cutting systems. A shadow crossed her face. He died 3 years ago. Heart stopped one morning without warning. If I'd been a son, I could have taken over the mill. As a daughter, the business was sold to his partner. That's not fair. No, she agreed, it's not. But fairness and reality are often different things. You work with reality and try to make it more fair where you can. By the time we finished setting the last post in early August, the structure's skeleton was visible. 16 posts forming a perfect rectangle around the cabin, each one plumb and true, each one exactly 8 feet from its neighbors. People started coming by to look. Some came out of curiosity, some came to mock. A few came because they were beginning to wonder if maybe possibly this strange widow might be onto something. Owen and I were working on the horizontal beams, the long timbers that would connect the posts and support the roof rafters, when Reverend Whitmore arrived on his mule. He dismounted slowly, studying the construction with the expression of a man trying to find charitable words for something he disapproved of. "Mrs. Brennan," he called, "might I have a word?" Margaret climbed down from the post where she'd been notching wood for the beam. "Reverend, what can I do for you?" "I've been hearing about your building project. The whole valley is talking about it." He gestured at the posts. "This is quite an undertaking for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," Margaret said, nodding toward my father and me. "Mr. Fletcher and his son have been invaluable." "Yes, about that." Whitmore's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Brennan, I wonder if you've considered the appearance of this arrangement. A widow and a widower working so closely, spending so much time together." The air seemed to crystallize. My father went very still, his hand tightening on the beam he was holding. "The appearance," Margaret repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "I mean no offense, but people talk. And in a community like ours, reputation matters, especially for a woman in your position. If tongues wag, it could make things difficult, for you and for your children." Margaret set down her tools with deliberate care. "Reverend Whitmore, let me make sure I understand. You're concerned that people might gossip about a woman trying to keep her children alive through the winter and the widower helping her in exchange for education for his son. I'm concerned about impropriety. The impropriety of building a structure in broad daylight with 3 children present at all times. That impropriety." Whitmore's face reddened. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm trying to help you." "Are you, She stepped closer. "Because from where I'm standing, you're suggesting I should care more about what people say than about whether my children freeze to death. You're suggesting I should turn away help I desperately need because it might look inappropriate to people who aren't offering any help of their own. I'm suggesting that a woman in your position needs to be above reproach." "No, Reverend. You're suggesting that a woman in my position needs to accept poverty and struggle and potential death because God forbid she work alongside a man to solve a problem." Margaret's voice didn't rise, but it cut like steel. "I've read my Bible, sir. I don't recall Jesus turning down help from anyone based on what the neighbors might say." My father made a small sound, something between a cough and a laugh. Reverend Whitmore gathered his dignity. "I'll pray for you, Mrs. Brennan, for wisdom and discernment." "Pray for warm weather through October," Margaret replied. "That would be more useful." The Reverend left. My father watched him go, then looked at Margaret with undisguised admiration. "That was something," he said. "That was necessary." Margaret picked up her tools again, but I could see her hands shaking slightly. "I'm tired of people telling me what I should do instead of actually helping." "For what it's worth," my father said quietly, "I think you're doing everything exactly right." Margaret looked at him, really looked, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people who'd both lost partners, both fighting to raise children alone, both refusing to accept defeat. "Thank you, Owen," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. The crisis came in mid-September, 6 weeks before the first serious snow. Margaret collapsed. I was at the cabin for my evening lesson when it happened. One moment she was standing at her desk checking calculations for the final roofing shakes. The next she swayed, caught the edge of the table, and went down in a heap of skirts and exhaustion. Catherine screamed. I ran for my father. He came at a dead run, lifted Margaret like she weighed nothing, and carried her to her bed. She was conscious, but barely, her face pale as milk, her breathing shallow. "Get Dr. Carlyle," my father ordered. "Ride hard." I rode harder than I'd ever ridden the 15 miles to Helena blurring past. Dr. Henry Carlyle was in his office, thank God, and he saddled up immediately. By the time we got back, Margaret was sitting up in bed protesting that she was fine, just tired, nothing to worry about. Dr. Carlyle examined her anyway, checked her pulse, her eyes, her color, asked questions about eating habits, sleep patterns, physical exertion. His diagnosis was brutally simple. "You are working yourself to death, Mrs. Brennan. 16 to 18-hour days on insufficient food and no rest. Your body is shutting down." "I don't have time to rest," Margaret said. "Look outside. That roof is 3/4 finished. The wood is cut, but not all of it stacked. Winter comes whether I'm ready or not." "Winter will come whether you're alive or not," Dr. Carlyle countered. "And if you die of exhaustion, what happens to those 3 children?" The question hit home. I saw it in Margaret's face, the fear she'd been pushing down finally surfacing. My father, who'd been standing silent by the door, spoke up. "She won't die, because I'm going to help. Really help, not just 4 hours in the morning, full days until this is finished." "Mr. Fletcher, I can't ask you to do that," Margaret protested. "You're not asking. I'm offering." He looked at Dr. Carlyle. "How long does she need to rest?" 3 days minimum. A week would be better." "She'll get 3 days. Then we work together reasonable hours until it's done." My father's tone left no room for argument. "That's the deal, Maggie. Take it or I walk away entirely." He'd called her Maggie, not Mrs. Brennan. Maggie. She stared at him, and I saw her pride warring with her desperation. Desperation won. 3 days, she agreed. Then we finish it together. Dr. Carlyle nodded approval and left instructions about rest and nutrition. After he departed, my father sent me home with instructions to handle evening chores alone. But before I left, I stopped at Margaret's bedside. "You're going to make it," I said. Not a question, a statement of fact. She managed a weak smile. "You sound very certain." "I am, because you're too stubborn to die and because my father won't let you, and because—" I paused, searching for the right words. "Because you taught me that problems have solutions if you're willing to think instead of just accepting what's always been done. And dying is a solution." Margaret reached out and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Peter. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in months." I rode home through the gathering dark, thinking about stubbornness and solutions and the way my father had looked at Margaret Brennan. Something was changing. Not just the cabin with its extended roof, not just my ability to read and write. Something larger. Something that felt like the foundation of a new family being built piece by careful piece in the shadow of posts and beams in the approaching winter. Just 3 inches melting by noon, but the message was clear. Winter was coming early and eager. Margaret stood in the doorway of her cabin, wrapped in a shawl, watching the white flakes drift down through the completed roof structure. The extended roofline worked exactly as she'd designed it. Snow fell on the outer edges and slid off the angled shakes. The corridor beneath stayed dry, the carefully stacked wood untouched by moisture. My father and I had worked alongside her for the past 2 weeks ever since her collapse. True to his word, he'd stopped treating this as a favor and started treating it as partnership. We worked dawn to dusk, but we took breaks. We ate proper meals. We paced ourselves. The difference was remarkable. In 14 days, we'd accomplished what might have taken Margaret alone 6 weeks. The roof was complete, every shake in place, every joint sealed with pitch. 4 cords of firewood stood stacked in neat rows under the covered corridor, elevated on a lattice of small poles that allowed air to circulate underneath. But 4 cords wasn't enough. Even with Margaret's calculations about dry wood efficiency, she needed at least 1 more cord, preferably 2, to be truly safe. And now snow was falling. The clock was ticking. "We have maybe 4 weeks," Margaret said, studying the sky. "Maybe 5 if we're lucky, after that serious cold sets in and cutting becomes nearly impossible." My father nodded. "We can do it. Between the 3 of us, another 1.25 is manageable." 3 of us, I looked up from where I'd been examining one of the support posts. "You're part of this now," my father said. "You can split the smaller pieces, help with stacking. Every bit helps." Pride swelled in my chest. I was 11 years old and I was being counted as part of the labor force. Not a child to be protected, but a contributor to survival. We worked through the rest of September in a rhythm that felt almost choreographed. My father felled trees and cut them to length. Margaret split the larger pieces with an axe, her form improving daily as she remembered techniques her father had taught her years ago. I split the smaller rounds with a hatchet and carried pieces to the stacking area. Catherine and Daniel helped with stacking, following Margaret's precise instructions about airflow and stability. Even young James contributed, bringing water and keeping the fire fed during meal breaks. We were a team, an unlikely cobbled-together team, but effective. It was during one of these long work days that I first understood something was growing between my father and Margaret that went beyond practical partnership. I'd gone to fetch water from the creek and was returning when I heard their voices, low and private. They stood near the woodpile, taking a brief rest, and my father was speaking. Anna used to tell me I worked too hard, he was saying. She'd make me sit down, bring me coffee, force me to rest, even when I insisted there was too much to do. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Smart, patient, good with numbers. You remind me of her in some ways. My father paused. I don't mean that I'm trying to replace her, or that you need replacing Thomas. I know what you mean. Margaret's voice was soft. Owen, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever feel guilty for being alive when they're not? The question hung in the air like morning mist. Every day, my father admitted. Every single day I think about how Anna should be here raising Peter, running the household. How it should be her teaching him to read, not your daughter. How I should be the one who died, not her. I feel the same. Thomas was strong, capable. He could have built this structure in half the time it's taking me. He could have cut 10 cords of wood without breaking a sweat. The children need a father, and instead they have me struggling and calculating and barely keeping ahead of disaster. Maggie, my father's voice was firm. Look at what you've built. Look at what you've accomplished. You designed a structure nobody else in this valley thought of. You calculated efficiency gains that are going to save your family. Thomas might have been strong, but strength isn't what your children needed. They needed someone smart enough to survive, and that's you. There was a long silence. Then Margaret said, Thank you for saying that, even if you are just being kind. I'm not being kind, I'm being honest. Another pause. And for what it's worth, Anna would have liked you. She always said the smartest people were the ones who admitted what they didn't know and then figured it out anyway. I backed away quietly, not wanting to intrude on the moment, but I carried those words with me as I returned to work. My father was healing. The grief that had turned him silent and distant was beginning to crack, letting light through. And Margaret, who'd arrived in the valley desperate and alone, was finding something she'd lost when Thomas died. Not just help, not just partnership, hope. October brought cold that settled in and stayed. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, climbed only to the 40s during the day. We worked faster, racing against the calendar. The pile of cut wood grew steadily, and Margaret's nightly calculations showed we were approaching her target. 5 cords, 5 and a quarter, 5 and a half. It was during this final push that Eleanor Blackwell arrived at the cabin, riding in a wagon loaded with supplies. Margaret straightened from the wood she'd been splitting, wariness crossing her face. Eleanor had not been friendly, and a visit from the trading post owner was rarely good news. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, moving with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested cold weather. She studied the completed structure, walking the entire perimeter, examining the posts and roof and the neatly stacked wood underneath. Finally, she stopped in front of Margaret. I came to collect on your debt. My father's hand moved toward the axe handle. I tensed. I don't have the money yet, Margaret said steadily, but I will come spring. You have my word. I don't want your money. Eleanor gestured to the wagon. I want to settle our account differently. Margaret's eyes narrowed. How? In there are 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of salt pork, 10 pounds of beans, 5 pounds of sugar, and 3 dozen candles. Enough to supplement your winter stores significantly. Eleanor met Margaret's gaze. I'm adding it to your account. No interest. Payment due next October when you've had time to establish yourself properly. Why would you do that? Because I was wrong about you. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, showing neither embarrassment nor excessive warmth. I thought you'd fail. I thought you were another foolish woman playing at homesteading without understanding what it takes. But you're not foolish. You're possibly the smartest person in this valley, and I make money backing smart people, not watching them starve. She climbed back onto her wagon. Also, if you survive the winter using that design, I expect half the homesteads in the territory will want to build similar structures next year. I plan to sell them the supplies they'll need. Consider this an investment in future business. Eleanor snapped the reins and drove away, leaving Margaret staring at the wagon full of supplies with an expression somewhere between gratitude and shock. "Well," my father said, "that's unexpected." "That's Eleanor Blackwell calculating profit margins," Margaret replied, but she was smiling, though I'll take it regardless of her motivations. We unloaded the supplies into the cabin, and that night, for the first time since I'd started my reading lessons, Margaret's face didn't show the constant tension of someone counting every penny and wondering if it would be enough. The last cord of wood was cut on October 26th. We stacked it carefully under the south side of the extended roof, filling the final gap in Margaret's carefully planned storage system. 6 cords total, arranged in precise rows that allowed maximum air circulation, all of it protected from weather and elevated above-ground moisture. Margaret stood back, surveying the result with the expression of a general who'd won a decisive battle. "It's done," she said quietly. "It's done," my father agreed, "and done well." I looked at the structure we'd built over 5 months of dawn to dusk labor. The cabin sat in the center, small and weathered but sound. Around it, the extended roof created a covered walkway 6 feet wide on all sides. 16 posts stood like sentinels, bearing the weight of the angled roof that shed water and would soon shed snow. Under that protective covering, 6 cords of bone-dry firewood waited to keep Margaret's family alive through whatever winter brought. It was beautiful in its functionality, elegant in its simplicity, and it was the first thing I'd helped build that would genuinely save lives. "You did it," I said to Margaret. "Everyone said it was impossible, and you did it anyway." "We did it," she corrected. "Your father and I, you and Catherine and Daniel, even little James bringing water and keeping spirits up. This wasn't one person's achievement, but we all knew whose design it was, whose calculations had made it possible, whose stubborn refusal to accept defeat had driven the entire project." That evening after my reading lesson, Margaret pulled out a new piece of bark and began drawing. Not calculations this time. A clean, careful diagram of the structure we'd built with measurements and angles and notes about construction techniques. "What's that for?" I asked. "For anyone who asks how to build one," she said. "I'm not keeping this knowledge to myself. If it works for us, it should work for others." "It will work," I said with certainty. "We'll know soon enough." Margaret looked toward the window where the last light of October was fading into November darkness. "Winter's here, Peter. The real test begins now." November arrived with temperatures that made October seem mild. 20 degrees at night, freezing during the day. The ground hardened to iron. The creek slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely locked in ice. Margaret began burning wood, steadily feeding the stove every 4 hours to maintain temperature. The convenience of the design became immediately apparent. She could open the cabin door, step 3 feet into the covered corridor, grab dry firewood, and return to warmth within 30 seconds. No coat required, no boots, no exposure to killing cold, no risk of disorientation in snow, no wood buried under drifts. The efficiency gain was obvious to anyone watching. Walter Brennan watched. So did other neighbors. Word spread through the valley that the widow's crazy design was actually working and working well. My father and I visited often, ostensibly for my continued reading lessons, but really because my father had stopped pretending he wasn't deeply concerned about Margaret's welfare. The relationship between them had progressed from partnership to something more, though neither had spoken of it directly. I didn't mind. Catherine had become like a sister. Daniel was teaching me to track animals in snow. Even young James would climb into my lap during lessons, listening to Catherine explain letters and words with the patient enthusiasm of a born teacher. We were becoming a family, slowly, carefully, like ice forming on still water, fragile yet growing stronger every day. Then on December 1st, Daniel began to cough. At first it seemed minor, a tickle in the throat, nothing concerning. But by December 3rd, the cough had deepened, wet and rattling, and Daniel's forehead burned with fever. Margaret tried everything. Herbal teas her mother had taught her, cold compresses, keeping him warm and hydrated. The fever climbed anyway. 101 degrees, 102, 103. My father and I arrived on the evening of December 3rd to find Margaret pacing the cabin, her face drawn with fear. Daniel lay on the bed flushed and sweating, coughing in harsh bursts that shook his small frame. "I need to take him to Helena," Margaret said, "to Dr. Carlyle." My father looked out the window at the darkening sky. "That's 15 miles. It'll be full night in an hour, and look at those clouds." We all looked, heavy dark pressing down on the valley like a threat. "I know," Margaret said, "but if I wait until morning and the fever keeps climbing, if it reaches 105, he could have seizures. Brain damage." Her voice cracked. "I can't lose him, Owen. I can't lose another one." My father was quiet for a long moment thinking through options. Finally, "If you take him tonight and a storm hits, you could both die on the trail. If you keep him here and manage the fever, he has a better chance. You have medicine, you have warmth, you have the ability to monitor him constantly. And if the fever doesn't break, then we'll reassess tomorrow." But making decisions based on what might happen instead of what is happening leads to bad choices. It was the most I'd ever heard my father say at once since my mother died. Margaret heard the wisdom in it even through her fear. "Help me," she whispered. "Of course." My father removed his coat. "Peter, ride home and bring back our medical supplies. Extra blankets, whatever dried meat we have. We're staying here tonight." I rode through the gathering darkness, fetched what was needed, and returned to find my father and Margaret working in practice coordination. She bathed Daniel with cool water. He kept the fire steady, maintaining cabin temperature at exactly 70 degrees. Catherine read to her brother, her young voice calm and soothing. James stayed close to his mother, silent and scared. The fever climbed to 103.5, then 104. Margaret's hands shook as she pressed snow, gathered from just outside the door in the covered corridor, to Daniel's forehead and neck. "Please," she whispered, "to God, to fate, to the universe, that had already taken her husband. Please don't take my son." Midnight came. The fever held at 104. Outside wind began to rise. By 2 in the morning, snow was falling. Heavy wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to nothing and made the 15-mile journey to Helena absolutely impossible. Margaret looked at my father with haunted eyes. "If I'd left earlier, you'd be lost in a blizzard with a sick child," my father said firmly. "You made the right choice." 3 in the morning, 104.2 degrees. Daniel's breathing was rapid and shallow. 4 in the morning, the wind howled like wolves. Snow hammered against the cabin walls, but didn't penetrate the covered corridor, didn't bury the firewood, didn't force anyone outside to fight through drifts for fuel. Margaret fed the stove, 3 steps to the corridor, grabbed dry wood, 3 steps back, closed the door. Never losing sight of her son, never exposing him to cold that could finish what the fever had started. 5 in the morning, Daniel's fever broke. 103.8, then 103, then 102. By 6, when gray dawn light filtered through the storm, Daniel was sleeping peacefully at 100 degrees, his breathing deeper and steadier. The crisis passed. Margaret collapsed into a chair and wept. Not delicate tears, but great shaking sobs of relief and exhausted terror, finally released. My father knelt beside her chair, his hand on her shoulder, saying nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Catherine climbed into her mother's lap, and James pressed against her side, and they stayed like that, while the storm raged outside and warmth from dry wood kept everyone safe. I stood at the window watching snow accumulate at rates I'd never seen. 2 inches, 4, 6. The drifts building against anything that stood above ground level. But in the covered corridor, the wood stayed dry, accessible, ready. The design worked. Under the worst possible conditions, at the most critical possible moment, Margaret's calculations and engineering had proven correct. She'd built more than a structure. She'd built survival itself. The storm lasted 4 days, 43 inches of snow, temperatures that dropped to 22 below zero, wind that created drifts tall enough to bury traditional cabins to their eaves. My father and I were trapped at the Brennan cabin, unable to return home through the whiteout conditions. We didn't mind. There was firewood steps away from the door, food from Eleanor's supplies, warmth and safety, and the growing certainty that this structure had proven itself beyond any possible doubt. On the fourth day, the storm broke. Sunlight hit new snow with blinding intensity. The world outside was transformed, buried under white, unrecognizable. And 2 miles away, though we didn't know it yet, Jacob Morrison was dead. Walter Brennan brought the news on the morning of January 7th, breaking trail on snowshoes to check on families in the valley. He stopped at the Brennan cabin, first drawn by the smoke rising from the chimney and the certainty that he'd find either survival or tragedy. He found survival. Margaret and her children, healthy and safe. My father and me, well-fed and warm. The cabin temperature at a comfortable 68 degrees, the wood supply barely touched, despite 4 days of constant burning. Walter stood in the covered corridor, running his hand over the stacked wood, all of it dry as bone, despite the storm that had just ravaged the valley. Morrison's dead, he said finally. Found him yesterday in his barn, froze trying to reach it from his cabin. 40 feet. He got disoriented in the whiteout, couldn't find his way back. The words hit like physical blows. Jacob Morrison, 63 years old, experienced and careful, dead because 40 feet of distance became impassable in a storm. How much wood did you burn? Walter asked Margaret. Half a cord over 4 days. I kept the cabin at 72 degrees because Daniel was sick. Half a cord that you could reach without risking your life. Walter looked at her with an expression I'd never seen on his weathered face. Respect deep and genuine. I was wrong, Mrs. Brennan. I thought you were wasting time on foolishness. But this? He gestured at the structure. This is smarter than anything we've been doing for decades. Morrison would be alive if he'd had this design. I don't like admitting when I'm wrong, but I'm wrong here. It was the closest thing to an apology Walter Brennan had ever given anyone. Word spread through the valley faster than spring melt. The widow's design worked. It had kept her family safe through the worst storm in memory. It had proven itself under conditions that killed experienced homesteaders. People started coming to ask questions. How did you build it? What measurements, what materials could they copy the design for their own cabins? Margaret shared everything freely. Measurements, angles, construction techniques. She drew diagrams on precious paper and gave them away. She explained the physics of moisture content and heat efficiency to anyone who would listen. The frontier is hard enough, she told my father one evening after another neighbor had left with a copied diagram. Keeping solutions to ourselves doesn't make us smarter. It just makes everyone's lives harder. By spring, 7 families in the valley were planning to build similar structures. By the following winter, covered wood storage was becoming standard practice, each family adapting Margaret's core principles to their own situations. On a warm day in late April, when snowmelt was turning the valley green, my father asked Margaret to marry him. Not romantically, not with flowers and poetry, practically the way they had approached everything else. We were all at the Brennan cabin, working on spring repairs to the roof and checking for damage from winter's weight. My father and Margaret stood in the covered corridor, examining a support post when he simply said it. Maggie, I think we should get married. She looked up startled. Owen, not because you need a man, you've proven you don't. Not because I need a woman, though I'll admit life's been better with you in it. He paused, choosing words carefully. Because 2 homesteads together are stronger than 2 apart. Because Peter and your children have become family already. Because I respect you more than I've respected anyone since Anna died, and respect is a better foundation than passion. Margaret was quiet for a long time. I don't love you the way I love Thomas. I know, I don't love you the way I loved Anna. But I think what we have is better suited to what's coming. Partnership, trust, mutual respect. Those things last when passion fades. I keep this cabin, Margaret said. I keep my independence. We're partners, not owner and property. I wouldn't want it any other way. And the children come first. Always. Always, my father agreed. Margaret reached out and took his hand. Then yes, I'll marry you. They were married in May in the small church in Unionville, with the entire community in attendance. Even Eleanor Blackwell came bringing a set of iron cookware as a wedding gift. I stood beside my father as his best man, wearing my only good shirt, my reading skills now advanced enough that I could follow along with the Bible verses Reverend Whitmore quoted. During the ceremony, I looked at the people gathered. Walter Brennan, who'd admitted he was wrong. Eleanor Blackwell, who'd invested in Margaret's success. The families who were already building their own versions of her design. Dr. Carlisle, who documented the reduction in cold-related illnesses in families using covered wood storage. Margaret had arrived in this valley desperate and alone, expected to fail, dismissed as foolish. She was leaving this church as an equal partner in a homestead, a respected member of the community, and the designer of a structure that would save lives for generations. All because she'd refused to accept that problems couldn't be solved. All because she'd chosen to think instead of surrender. I'm 68 years old now, sitting in my office in Missoula, telling this story to a young architect who thinks he's discovered something new. I became an engineer as Margaret predicted I would. Designed bridges and water systems and storage facilities across Montana. Every time I approached a problem, I thought of her. I thought of bark covered in calculations and a woman who transformed survival through simple physics and stubborn determination. Margaret and my father had two more children together. Emily in 1876, Thomas Jr. in 1878. They combined their homesteads into a successful ranch that supported both families comfortably. Margaret lived to be 81 years old. She died in 1923, and her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned her work with the school board in the Methodist Church, but didn't mention the design that had spread across the territory and saved countless lives. The innovation had become invisible through success absorbed so completely into local building tradition that its origin was forgotten. But I remember. And now David Hayes, young architect with his careful sketches and academic curiosity, you know too. I walk to my office window. Outside, Missoula spreads across the valley, modern buildings rising where wilderness once stood. But if you know where to look, you can still see the old homesteads on the outskirts. And some of them, the ones built between 1873 and 1900, still have those extended roof lines, still have covered storage, still follow the principles a desperate widow calculated on pieces of bark by lamplight. Why did you tell me this story? David asks. I turn to face him. Because you're going to be an engineer. You're going to face problems people say can't be solved. You're going to have ideas people call crazy. I gesture at his sketch. When that happens, remember Margaret Brennan. Remember that the best solutions often come from the people everyone underestimates. Remember that wisdom isn't about following tradition. It's about understanding what works when lives depend on it. David carefully rolls up his sketch. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. This is exactly what I needed for my thesis. After he leaves, I sit alone in my office, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, and I let myself remember. A cabin surrounded by an extended roof. A woman who calculated heat efficiency when everyone said she should just cut more wood. 3 children who survived because their mother refused to accept the impossible. My father once told me that Anna would have liked Margaret. He was right. They were both women who understood that intelligence and determination could overcome almost anything. I learned to read because Margaret Brennan needed help cutting wood. But I learned to think, truly think, because she showed me that every problem has a solution if you're willing to imagine what could be instead of accepting what is. Her neighbors laughed at the shed that surrounded her cabin. Right up until the blizzard proved them wrong. After that, they stopped laughing and started measuring post spacing. Because on the frontier, wisdom wasn't about pride or tradition. It was about what worked when the temperature dropped to 30 below and your children were depending on you to keep them alive. That kind of wisdom built communities in impossible places, not through grand inventions or revolutionary technology, but through small improvements that made hard lives slightly more manageable. Margaret Brennan understood that. She built it. She lived it. And though history forgot her name, her legacy remains in every covered woodshed, every protected storage area, every structure that keeps families safe when winter comes. That's not just engineering. That's love made practical. That's hope built from timber and determination. That's the winter a widow taught a valley how to survive. And that's a story worth remembering.